Emily Lawson was the perfect daughter, brilliant, kind, and destined for success. Mark and Susan Lawson had spent their lives believing they had raised someone exceptional. But when the truth came out, when police stormed into a university lecture hall and arrested Emily for a string of brutal murders, their world shattered. How had they missed the signs? How had their loving, intelligent daughter become a cold-blooded killer? The answers lay hidden in the past, in the small, overlooked moments that, in hindsight, had been warning signs of the unimaginable. Emily Lawson was the kind of daughter any parent would be proud of. From an early age, she stood out, not just for her intelligence, but for the kindness and grace with which she carried herself. In school, she was always at the top of her class, excelling in science and psychology. Teachers described her as diligent, disciplined, and mature beyond her years. She was the student who never caused trouble, the friend who always knew the right thing to say, and the child who made her parents feel as though they had done everything right. Her parents, Mark and Susan, had built a comfortable life in a quiet suburban town where nothing truly bad ever seemed to happen. They raised Emily with love, teaching her the value of hard work and compassion. Unlike many teenagers, she was never rebellious. She never got into fights, never broke curfew, and never showed any signs of anger or resentment. To them, she was perfect. Even outside of school, Emily remained an inspiration. She volunteered at an animal shelter, helping rehabilitate abandoned pets. She spent weekends tutoring younger students who struggled in subjects she excelled in. To anyone looking in from the outside, she had the ideal life, a bright future ahead of her, a family that adored her, and a heart full of ambition. When she got accepted into a prestigious university to study forensic psychology, her parents couldn't have been prouder. Emily's fascination with crime and human behavior seemed natural given her field of study. She often spoke passionately about criminal profiling, discussing famous cases and the psychology of killers. She explained that understanding them was the first step in stopping them. Mark and Susan found it unsettling at times, but they chalked it up to academic curiosity. During her time at university, small changes in Emily's behavior began to emerge. At first, they were subtle, so minor that they barely registered. She called home less frequently, though she assured them she was just busy with coursework. When she did visit, she seemed tired, distracted. Her once bright and engaging personality had dulled, replaced by something more distant, more reserved. Her parents assumed it was stress. College could be overwhelming, and forensic psychology wasn't an easy field. They never imagined there was a darker reason behind her transformation. Meanwhile, their town and the surrounding areas were being gripped by fear. A series of brutal murders had begun making headlines, each one more horrifying than the last. Young men and women, seemingly unconnected, were disappearing. Days or weeks later, their bodies would be found, discarded like trash in remote locations. The police had no leads. The killer left no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that could point to an identity. Emily's parents followed the news like everyone else, horrified by the growing number of victims. They never once thought that the monster responsible could be their own daughter. The idea was too absurd, too impossible to even entertain. But in just a few months, their world would be shattered in ways they never thought possible. Susan Lawson had never been the type to invade her daughter's privacy. She and Mark had always trusted Emily, never feeling the need to pry into her personal life. But something had been bothering her for weeks. Emily had returned home for the holidays, and while she was physically present, she felt emotionally distant. She spent hours in her room with the door locked, sometimes leaving late at night and returning before dawn. When asked where she had been, she would give vague answers, just out for a drive, getting some air, clearing her mind. Her mother wanted to believe her, but an unease settled deep in her chest, one she could no longer ignore. One evening, when Emily had gone out again, Susan decided to tidy up her room. It was something she had done for years, a small gesture of love, but this time it was different. As she dusted the shelves, she noticed a small, locked metal box tucked behind a row of books. Something about it made her uneasy. It was hidden too carefully, as though it was never meant to be found. Her fingers hesitated before she reached for it, a voice in the back of her mind warning her to stop. But she couldn't. After searching the room for a key and coming up empty, she took the box to the garage and pried it open with a screwdriver. The lid popped with a soft metallic snap, and inside, she found a collection of newspaper clippings. Her breath caught in her throat as she spread them out on the table, her hands trembling. Every article was about the recent murders that had terrorized their town. Victims' names, dates, locations. It was all there, carefully preserved as if someone had been studying them. Dread curled around her like a vice as she dug deeper. Beneath the articles lay a bundle of photographs. They weren't the kind taken from newspapers. These were personal, close-up shots of the victims. Some appeared to have been taken while they were still alive, others after their deaths. Susan gasped, dropping them as though they burned her fingers. Her stomach churned as she reached the bottom of the box and pulled out a leather-bound journal. She flipped it open, hoping, praying for an explanation that would make sense. What she found instead was something out of a nightmare. Detailed entries, written in her daughter's neat handwriting, described the murders with chilling precision. She read descriptions of how the victims were chosen, followed, and ultimately killed. The way Emily wrote about it, clinical, detached, yet disturbingly meticulous, sent a cold shiver through Susan's spine. Mark arrived home to find his wife pale and shaking, the evidence spread out before her. He tried to reason with her, to convince himself there was some mistake. But Susan knew. The girl they had raised, the daughter they had loved unconditionally, was not who they thought she was. Their world had just unraveled, and nothing would ever be the same again. Mark and Susan sat in their living room, staring at the horrifying evidence before them. The weight of the discovery pressed down on them, suffocating and inescapable. Every instinct told them to protect their child, to deny what they had seen, to find some alternate explanation. But the truth was right in front of them, written in Emily's own words. The daughter they had raised, the girl they had loved so deeply, was a murderer. For hours they debated what to do. Could they confront her? Would she deny it? Would she lash out? The thought of turning their own child over to the police was unthinkable, yet so was the idea of allowing her to continue killing. Mark picked up the blood-stained shirt they had found in Emily's closet, turning it over in his hands. It wasn't an abstract horror anymore. It was real, undeniable. He knew what they had to do. The next morning, they drove to the police station with a bag full of evidence. Susan could barely speak as they laid out the items before the detectives. The officers listened in silence, their expressions shifting from skepticism to shock as they examined the journal. The details matched the crime scenes exactly, details that had never been released to the public. Emily hadn't just followed the cases in the news, she had lived them. At first, the detectives struggled to believe it. Emily had no criminal record, no history of violence. She was a bright young woman studying psychology, not a suspect on their radar. But as they cross-referenced her notes with their case files, the horrifying reality set in. The writing described not only the murders they knew about, but also others they had yet to solve. It was worse than they had imagined. A surveillance team was assigned to watch Emily's movements. Over the next few days, they tracked her as she went about her routine, attending lectures, studying in the library, and going out late at night. Nothing seemed suspicious at first, but then they found footage of her leaving a cafe with a young woman who had been reported missing just hours earlier. It was enough to act. The police decided to strike when Emily was least expecting it. One afternoon, as she sat in a lecture hall taking notes, officers stormed in. The professor stopped mid-sentence as the room filled with the sound of footsteps and the sharp command for Emily to stand. Students watched in shock as she was handcuffed and escorted out. Some whispered in confusion. Others simply stared, unable to process what they were seeing. Emily remained eerily calm throughout the arrest. She didn't ask why they were taking her, nor did she struggle. As the officers led her to the waiting car, she finally spoke, offering them the faintest of smiles. "Took you long enough." Mark and Susan watched the news later that evening, their daughter's face now plastered across every channel. The nightmare had only just begun. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as the trial of Emily Lawson began. Journalists filled the rows, cameras flashing outside the courthouse as the world waited to hear how a seemingly perfect young woman had become one of the most notorious killers in recent history. Mark and Susan sat in the front row, their hands clasped tightly together, bracing themselves for what they were about to hear. They had spent their lives protecting their daughter, guiding her, loving her, and now they were forced to witness the unmasking of a stranger. The prosecution wasted no time painting Emily as a cold, calculating predator. They laid out the gruesome details of each murder, using her own journal as their strongest piece of evidence. The pages, filled with handwritten notes, detailed her methods, thoughts, and emotions, or lack thereof. She had written about how she chose her victims, how she studied them, how she took pleasure in outsmarting law enforcement. Every word was damning. When the forensic evidence was presented, the courtroom fell into stunned silence. The blood-stained clothing found in her closet matched the DNA of multiple victims. Fibers from her car's interior were found on one of the bodies, placing her at the scene. Surveillance footage, once circumstantial, now painted an undeniable picture. The evidence was overwhelming, yet Emily showed no emotion. She sat still, her expression neutral, as if she were merely an observer rather than the accused. The defense tried to argue that Emily suffered from severe psychological disorders. They called in experts who claimed she might have antisocial personality disorder or even a trauma-induced psychosis. They suggested she had been battling something deep within her mind, something uncontrollable. But the prosecution dismantled this argument with chilling efficiency. Emily's journal entries showed premeditation, a deliberate effort to evade capture, and an understanding of right and wrong. She wasn't insane. She was aware of what she was doing, and she enjoyed it. Mark and Susan struggled to reconcile the daughter they had raised with the person described in court. They listened as witnesses testified, former classmates, professors, neighbors. Some described her as brilliant, kind, and ambitious. Others, including students who had studied alongside her, recalled moments of unease, instances where her fascination with murder seemed too intense, too personal. In hindsight, the signs had been there, hidden beneath the surface, overlooked by those who never thought to question them. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict: guilty, on all counts. The judge wasted no time in sentencing Emily to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the words echoed through the courtroom, Susan felt something inside her shatter. She had already lost her daughter to darkness long before this trial, but now it was final. As Emily was led away, she finally turned to look at her parents. There was no sadness, no remorse, only a small, knowing smile before she disappeared through the doors. The aftermath of Emily Lawson's conviction left an irreparable void in the lives of Mark and Susan. The trial had ended, the media frenzy had begun to die down, but their nightmare was far from over. The world now knew their daughter as a monster, and by extension, they became objects of scrutiny. Reporters hounded them, neighbors whispered behind their backs, and online forums dissected their lives, questioning how they could have raised a serial killer without realizing it. Every day brought a fresh wave of judgment, and no matter where they went, they could not escape the shadow of Emily's crimes. The home that had once been filled with warmth now felt suffocating. Every room carried memories of their daughter. Photographs of her smiling at birthdays and graduations, childhood drawings still framed on the walls, little reminders of the girl they thought they knew. But those memories were tainted now. Mark found himself staring at Emily's childhood pictures, searching for something he had missed. Had there been a sign? A moment where they could have stopped this from happening? Susan, once a proud mother, now recoiled at the sight of her own last name. It was the name attached to headlines, documentaries, and books that would forever mark their family as the parents of a killer. The town that had once embraced them now looked at them with suspicion. Friends they had known for years kept their distance, uncomfortable with their presence. Susan stopped going to the grocery store, unable to handle the stares. Mark withdrew into himself, unable to answer the questions that haunted him every night. Had Emily always been this way, or had something changed? Was she born a killer, or had something happened to turn her into one? There were no answers, only an unbearable silence that filled their home. In prison, Emily thrived in ways that horrified her parents even more. She showed no remorse, no regret. Instead, she became something of a fascination to criminologists and true crime enthusiasts. She gave carefully worded interviews, her calm demeanor chilling to those who listened. She spoke about her crimes without shame, analyzing herself the way she once studied criminals in textbooks. People online debated her intelligence, her motives, even romanticized her as if she were some kind of dark genius. But Mark and Susan saw only their daughter, the little girl they had once held in their arms, now a stranger they could no longer reach. As the years passed, Mark and Susan faded from public view. They sold their house, changed their contact information, and tried to build a life in anonymity. But no matter how far they went, Emily's presence was inescapable. She lived in books, in documentaries, in internet discussions. The world would never forget her, and by extension, it would never forget them. They spent the rest of their lives burdened by a question they could never answer. Had they ever truly known their daughter, or had they been living with a stranger all along?